Your menu is too traditional for where we want to take this restaurant. That's what Vanessa told me after calling me into her office one Tuesday afternoon. She'd owned Cloudmarsh Tech for barely 3 weeks and already had opinions about the food I'd been cooking for 7 years. I'm Luca Moretti, 43 years old, executive chef at what used to be Briarloft Bistro in Providence, Rhode Island. I'd built this place from a quiet neighborhood spot into one of the most respected restaurants on the East Coast. Not with flashy techniques or molecular gastronomy, with food that reminded people of something real. We need a fresh culinary identity, she continued, barely looking up from her laptop. Something more Instagram-worthy, more fusion, more excitement. I didn't argue, just nodded once and asked when my last day would be. She seemed surprised by that, by how easily I accepted it, like she expected me to beg or negotiate, but I don't beg for people to understand what they can't see. 7 years I'd poured my soul into those dishes. 7 years of adjusting recipes my grandmother taught me in Naples when I was barely tall enough to see over the counter. 7 years of building a menu that made people close their eyes when they took the first bite. Vanessa smiled, relieved. 2 weeks should be sufficient for transition. You'll need to provide detailed recipes for all signature dishes, of course. I nodded again, though we both knew I'd never written down a single recipe. Not the real ones, not the way I actually made them. That evening during service, I watched my kitchen staff move like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Jason working the grill with the timing of a metronome. Ellie plating with the precision of a surgeon. They didn't know yet. None of them knew that the heart was about to be cut out of this place. After closing, I sat alone at the bar with a glass of bourbon. The dining room was dark except for the small light above me. I ran my fingers over the worn bar top where I'd served thousands of customers who'd become friends. The next morning, Thomas, my sous chef for 5 years, caught me storing my personal knives in their roll. "Chef, what's going on?" I told him about the meeting. His face changed, anger flashing behind his eyes. "This is bullshit. The restaurant's doing better than ever. It's her place now," I said, continuing to pack. "But those are your recipes, your dishes, people come here for your food." I just shrugged. Not anymore. As I walked to my car that evening, I glanced back at the restaurant's glowing sign. Something twisted in my stomach. Not sadness exactly. Something sharper. Something that told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. My grandfather opened the first Moretti's in Naples when he was 22. I grew up watching him make magic with nothing more than flour, eggs, and whatever vegetables looked good at the market. Food wasn't fancy in our family. It was honest. It was memory. It was the thing that made people pause their lives for a moment and remember what mattered. I didn't come to Providence planning to be a chef. I was studying architecture at Rhode Island School of Design, working nights washing dishes to pay tuition. Then, one evening, the line cook called in sick. The owner was desperate. I stepped in. Something clicked that night. The rhythm of the kitchen felt more right than any drafting table ever had. 6 months later, I dropped out. My father didn't speak to me for a year. I worked my way up through 4 different kitchens before landing at Briarloft when it was just a struggling bistro, with outdated decor and a menu no one remembered. The owner, Harold, was ready to close the doors when he decided to give me full control of the kitchen. "Make food that matters to you," he said. "I'm all out of ideas." So I did. I built a menu around the dishes my grandmother made. The braised lamb that simmered for 6 hours with rosemary and juniper. The seafood stew with saffron that my grandfather learned from his mother. The olive oil cake soaked in orange liqueur that we served at every family wedding. People noticed. First locals, then food critics, then tourists who'd read about us online. We weren't trendy. We were something that lasted longer. Necessary. Harold sold the place when his wife got sick. Needed the money for treatments. I understood. The new owners were a restaurant group who mostly left me alone. "Don't fix what isn't broken," their CEO told me. For 3 years it worked. Then they sold to Vanessa. She started showing up during prep, asking questions that made it clear she didn't understand restaurants or food. She'd bring friends in during service, sending back dishes because they weren't pretty enough for their social media. 2 weeks before she fired me, I overheard her on the phone. "We'll keep the name for now, but everything else changes. New concept, new chef, new energy." I should have prepared then. Should have seen it coming. But some part of me couldn't believe anyone would dismantle something that worked so well. Something people loved. The night before my last day, I made all our signature dishes one final time, tasting each one, committing the exact flavors to memory. Not that I needed to. These dishes were in my blood. My last night at Briarloft was quiet. I didn't make a speech, didn't want a party. Just cooked service like any other night, though my hands felt heavier with each dish I sent out. After closing, I left my keys on Vanessa's desk along with a list of recipes. The official ones we kept for health inspections and line cooks. Not my recipes. Not really. I drove home to my small apartment and opened a bottle of Barolo I'd been saving. Sat on my balcony looking at the city lights and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a hollow space where 7 years of work used to live. The next morning, my phone buzzed with texts from the kitchen staff. Vanessa had brought in a new executive chef, some guy named Kevin who'd worked at a trendy spot in Boston. He was already changing things, they said, rearranging the kitchen, talking about elevating the menu. I didn't respond, just turned off my phone and took a walk downtown. 3 days passed before Thomas showed up at my door, still wearing his kitchen whites, eyes wild. "It's a disaster," he said, pushing past me into my apartment. "Kevin can't replicate anything. He's trying, but the dishes are coming out wrong." "They have the recipes," I said. Thomas gave me a look. "They have what you wrote down, not what you actually did." I shrugged and poured him a glass of water. New chef, new restaurant, that's how it works. "The regulars are noticing. Mrs. Carpenter sent back the lamb twice last night, said it wasn't right." Mrs. Carpenter had been coming every Thursday for 5 years. Always ordered the lamb. Always told me it reminded her of the year she spent in southern Italy before her husband died. "They're doing a big relaunch next week," Thomas continued. "Food critics, influencers, the whole show. Vanessa's calling it Briarloft Evolved." Something shifted in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but recognition, the beginning of an answer to a question I hadn't fully formed yet. "You looking for work?" I asked. Thomas blinked. "What?" "My grandfather's old place downtown. The building's empty. Been sitting there since he died. I still own it. You thinking about opening your own spot?" I hadn't been, not consciously. But saying it out loud made something clear. I'd given 7 years to someone else's dream. Maybe it was time to build my own. "Maybe," I said. "You interested?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Hell yes. And I bet Ellie and Jason would come too." That night, I couldn't sleep. I pulled out my grandfather's old notebook, the one with half-written recipe ideas and notes about customers. His handwriting was shaky in later years, but his thinking was always clear. On the inside cover, he'd written, "The food remembers even when people forget." I ran my finger over those words and felt something stir. Not anger at Vanessa or even a desire for revenge, something cleaner. The simple need to make food that mattered again. Food that was mine. The week after I left, food bloggers started posting about changes at Briarloft. Pictures of deconstructed versions of my dishes. Foam where there should have been sauce. Tiny portions arranged like abstract art. Comments sections filled with confused regulars. What happened to the real menu? This isn't what made this place special. I was painting my grandfather's old restaurant space when Vanessa called. First time I'd heard from her since I'd left. "Luca," she said, voice honey-sweet. "How are you?" "Fine. We're having some transition challenges. I was hoping you might be available for consultation, just to help smooth things over." I set down my paint roller. "What kind of challenges?" She paused. "Some of the signature dishes aren't coming out quite right. Kevin is talented, but customers are noticing differences." "You have the recipes," I said, repeating what I'd told Thomas. Yes, but there seemed to be nuances missing. I almost laughed. Nuances. Like how I adjusted the lamb seasoning based on the time of year. How the seafood stew needed more acid when using Gulf shrimp instead of local catch. How the olive oil cake required a different bake time on humid days. I could compensate you well, she continued, and credit you as a consulting chef. I'm busy, I said. Look, Luca, her voice hardened. The relaunch is in 3 days. We have critics and investors coming. I need those dishes to be right. Then you shouldn't have fired the person who created them. She was silent for a moment. I'll double your last salary, just for 2 weeks of consultation. No, triple it. It's not about money, Vanessa. Then what is it about? Some wounded pride? I made a business decision. And now I'm making one. Good luck with your relaunch. I hung up and went back to painting. An hour later, Thomas called to tell me Vanessa was in the kitchen, watching the cooks prepare my dishes, making notes, and asking detailed questions about every step. 2 days before the relaunch, I was at the farmer's market when Harold, the original owner, found me examining tomatoes. Heard what happened, he said, stepping beside me. Also heard you're opening your own place. News traveled fast in the restaurant world. Thinking about it. Vanessa called me yesterday, asked if I had any notes or records about your cooking from when you started. Sounded desperate. I raised an eyebrow. What did you tell her? That your food was always magic to me. I never knew how you did it. He picked up a tomato, weighed it in his hand. She's in trouble, you know. Those investors are expecting the same restaurant they've been reading about for years. The one you built? That afternoon, Ellie, my former pastry chef, texted, "They're trying to reverse engineer your olive oil cake. On the 5th attempt, still not right." I smiled despite myself. That cake had taken me 2 years to perfect. The night before the relaunch, Vanessa showed up at my apartment. I was surprised enough to let her in. "One last offer," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Come back. Full creative control. 20% ownership stake." I leaned against my counter. Why? Because the practice run tonight was a disaster. Because our reservations for the next month are built on your reputation. Because I made a miscalculation. For a moment I considered it. 20% was significant. But then I thought about my grandfather's empty restaurant, about cooking on my own terms. "I appreciate the offer," I said. "But I've started something new." Her face hardened. "If you're opening a competing restaurant, you should know your contract had a non-compete clause. You can't open within 5 miles of Briarloft for 2 years. I hadn't remembered that, hadn't thought to check. "Good to know," I said, opening my door. "Good luck tomorrow." After she left, I called my cousin Anthony, who practiced business law. The non-compete was real and potentially enforceable. My new spot was only 2 miles from Briarloft. I'd hit a wall I hadn't seen coming. That night I couldn't sleep. I reviewed my options, delay opening, move locations, fight the non-compete in court. None felt right. At 3 a.m., I drove to my grandfather's building and sat in the half-renovated space, thinking. The next morning, relaunch day at Briarloft, I met with Anthony at his office. He reviewed the contract again, brow furrowed. "There might be a loophole," he said finally. "The non-compete specifies you can't open a similar restaurant concept with competing cuisine within 5 miles. And? Define similar concept. Your grandfather's place was a traditional Italian restaurant, right? Not new American like Briarloft." I considered this. My menu at Briarloft had Italian influences but wasn't strictly traditional. I'd been planning something similar for the new place. My dishes, my style, but not bound by tradition. "What if I went old school?" I said slowly. "Completely traditional. My grandfather's exact recipes. Red checkered tablecloths. Chianti bottles with candles." Anthony nodded. "Different enough concept that we could argue it doesn't compete directly. Risky, but possible." I thanked him and left, mind racing. I'd been so focused on recreating what I'd built at Briarloft that I hadn't considered going back to my roots, to the food that had started everything. On my way home, I got a text from Jason, who was still working at Briarloft. Critics are here. Food's not right. Kevin's panicking. I didn't respond. Wasn't my problem anymore. That evening, Thomas, Ellie, and Jason came over after their shift, faces grim. It was a bloodbath, Thomas said, accepting the beer I offered. None of the signature dishes worked. The lamb was tough, the stew was bland, and the cake was dense as a brick. Vanessa kept making excuses, Ellie added, blaming ingredient suppliers, kitchen equipment, everything but the obvious. Which is, I asked. That they don't have you, Jason said simply. We talked into the night about what had happened, how Kevin had tried to follow my written recipes but missed all the unwritten steps, how the critics had been visibly disappointed, how Vanessa had disappeared into her office halfway through service. There's more, Thomas said, lowering his voice though we were alone in my apartment. I overheard Vanessa on the phone with someone, an investor, I think. Turns out she leveraged everything to buy Briarloft. Expected to flip it for a quick profit. Based on its reputation, I said. He nodded. Which was built on your food. She's in trouble, Ellie said. Without good reviews from this relaunch, she might lose backing. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This had never been about my cooking. It had been about money, about using what I'd built to turn a profit. I'm opening my grandfather's place, I said, going back to traditional Italian, his recipes, his way. What about the non-compete? Thomas asked. I explained Anthony's thinking. Different concept, different target. And honestly, if she wants to fight me on it, let her try. Her restaurant's about to have bigger problems. The next morning, the first reviews appeared online. They were as brutal as expected. A pale imitation of its former self. All style, no substance. The soul of Briarloft has vanished. That afternoon, I signed a lease on a small storefront across from my grandfather's building. A place for a simple cafe. A place where I could cook while renovations continued on the main restaurant. I named it Moretti's Table. No concept, no gimmicks, just food that mattered. On a hunch, I drove past Briarloft that night. The parking lot was half empty. A paper sign on the door announced, "Limited menu tonight." The unraveling had begun. 3 weeks later, Moretti's Table was ready to open. Nothing fancy, just 12 tables, white walls, and my grandfather's old copper pots hanging in the kitchen. I'd handwritten the menu, 5 appetizers, 5 entrees, 3 desserts. All his recipes, unchanged since he'd perfected them decades ago. I'd been careful about permits, licenses, everything legal. Anthony had reviewed all the paperwork to ensure we were protected if Vanessa decided to make trouble. But so far, she'd been silent. According to Thomas, who'd quit Briarloft along with Ellie and Jason, she was too busy trying to save her investment to worry about me. The night before opening, my father called. We hadn't spoken much since I'd left architecture school 15 years ago. Your mother told me about the new place, he said. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Opening tomorrow. Using Nono's recipes? Everyone, I said. Just like he made them. A long pause. He'd be proud. More than he would have been of another architect in the family. Something tightened in my chest. You should come sometime. Maybe I will, he said. Then, I kept his old recipe book. The real one, with all his notes. Your mother thought you might want it. I hadn't known it existed. I would. Very much. 2 days after we opened, with no advertising beyond an Instagram post by Ellie, we had a line out the door. Word had spread among Briarloft regulars that I was cooking again. We served 40 covers that night with just the 4 of us working. Me and Thomas in the kitchen, Ellie and Jason handling the front. Every dish went out exactly as my grandfather would have made it. Simple, perfect, honest. A week later, Mrs. Carpenter, the Thursday lamb regular from Briarloft, found us. She hugged me with tears in her eyes. I've been looking everywhere for you, she said. Nothing's been right since you left. That night, I added my grandfather's lamb to the menu just for her. 2 weeks in, we were booked solid every night. I'd hired 2 more kitchen staff and another server. My father had sent the recipe book, a tattered leather journal filled with my grandfather's secrets. Things I'd never known about his cooking, about where he'd learned, about what each dish meant to him. It felt like he was there in the kitchen with me. On our 1-month anniversary, I arrived early to find a manila envelope taped to the door. Inside was a formal letter from Vanessa's lawyer alleging violation of the non-compete agreement and threatening legal action. I handed it to Anthony over coffee that afternoon. "Right on schedule," he said, scanning the document. I was wondering when this would come. "Can they shut us down?" He set down the letter. "They can try, but I've been building our case since we talked. I have documented evidence that Moretti's Table is a traditional Italian restaurant based on your family recipes. Completely different from the new American cuisine at Briarloft. Different target audience, different price point, different concept." So we're good? Better than good. Their argument is extremely weak, especially now that Briarloft itself has changed its menu completely. This was news to me. They did. Anthony nodded. Went full molecular gastronomy last week. Foams, gels, the works. Trying to chase the latest trend. They've essentially admitted through their actions that they're not the same restaurant you worked at. I smiled. Perfect timing. That evening, as I was prepping for service, a food critic from the Providence Journal walked in, the same one who'd written a scathing review of Briarloft's relaunch. He didn't know I recognized him. I just cooked. Sent out food that would have made my grandfather proud. The next morning, his review appeared. The heart of Briarloft didn't vanish, it just moved across town and found its true home. By noon, our reservation list was full for the next 3 months. 6 months after opening Moretti's Table, I received a call from Harold, the original owner of Briarloft. "Have you seen it?" he asked without preamble. "Seen what?" "Briarloft's for sale. Vanessa's cutting her losses." I hadn't known, hadn't really thought about Briarloft in months. I'd been too busy running my own place, expanding the menu, training staff. "Asking price is half what she paid," Harold continued. "She's desperate for a quick sale." "Not my problem," I said, though something stirred in me. Not quite satisfaction, but a sense of things coming full circle. That afternoon, Anthony called. "Vanessa's dropping the lawsuit. Seems she has bigger problems." "Like selling a failing restaurant." "Exactly. Want to know the best part? Her investors are suing her for misrepresentation, claiming she sold them on the reputation of a restaurant that no longer exists." I thought about that as I prepped for dinner service, about the shortcuts Vanessa had tried to take, about how she'd seen only the surface of what made Briarloft special, never understanding the foundation it was built on. 3 days later, a Blacktown car pulled up outside Moretti's during lunch service. Vanessa stepped out, straightened her jacket, and walked inside. The dining room fell silent as regulars recognized her. I watched from the kitchen pass as she scanned the packed restaurant, taking in the simple decor, the happy diners, the staff moving with practiced precision. Then she saw me. Our eyes met across the room. I expected anger, resentment. Instead, I saw something like resignation, maybe even respect. She gave a small nod, turned, and walked out. I never saw her again. The following week, Briarloft closed its doors permanently. The building remained empty for months, a quiet monument to ambition without understanding. I didn't celebrate, didn't need to. The food had spoken for itself. 1 year after opening Moretti's Table, we expanded into my grandfather's original building next door. The renovation was complete. His old copper pots still hanging in the new, larger kitchen. We kept the cafe as a lunch spot and opened the main restaurant for dinner service. On opening night, I stood in the kitchen doorway watching the dining room fill. Families, couples, regulars who'd followed me from Briarloft, new faces drawn by word of mouth. Thomas nudged my shoulder. "You going to stand there all night, or are we cooking?" I smiled and returned to the line. Halfway through service, Ellie appeared in the kitchen. "There's someone here to see you." In the dining room, at a corner table, sat my father. He stood when he saw me, extending his hand formally. I ignored it and hugged him instead. "The place looks good," he said, glancing around, "just like Nono had it." "With a few updates," I admitted, "but the heart's the same." We talked through his meal, the first real conversation we'd had in years, about my grandfather, about food, about what it meant to build something that lasted. As he was leaving, he pressed something into my hand, a key. "To the vineyard in Campania," he explained. "Nono left it to me, but it should be yours. Maybe someday you'll make wine as good as your food." That night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone at the bar with a glass of my grandfather's favorite Amaro. The dining room was dark except for the small light above me. On the wall hung a framed copy of that Providence Journal review. The heart of Briarloft didn't vanish. It just moved across town and found its true home. I'd never set out to destroy what Vanessa built. I'd only wanted to create something authentic, something true. In the end, that had been enough. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply doing what you were meant to do, and doing it well. I raised my glass to my grandfather's memory and to the empty chairs that would fill again tomorrow. This place wasn't just a restaurant. It was home.